We are in Daniel, the 11th chapter, and I'm going to dive right into this because, as you've seen the last couple weeks, there's lots and lots of information to dive through here, and so we're going to dive right into this. Daniel, the 11th chapter. A couple of things to remember. We're not going to rehash everything for review, but a couple of really important things to remember is the 10th and the 11th chapter are an explanation, expansion, if you will, of the 8th and 9th chapter of Daniel. Daniel had these visions, and he understood some of it, would seem. He didn't understand all of it. So Gabriel comes to him, the angel, and he says, let me tell you what this means. In the 11th chapter in particular, several hundred years take place in great detail in this 11th chapter. In fact, the number one criticism of this chapter is it was obviously written after the events because it's way too accurate and way too detailed. So we've noted the evidence to the contrary of that as we've went throughout this study. So last week, we read a verse from Daniel, the 9th chapter, in verse 25, where it's talking about the 70 weeks that were going to take place, and this little statement that now we're expanding on. Because as I just said, the 11th chapter is an expansion of the visions that Daniel already had. And so that statement, if you recall from Daniel 9:25, is in troublesome times. So the idea was that the salvation of the Jews, the rebuilding of the temple was to take place, but it was going to happen in troublesome times. Seems like a simple, almost innocent, it's not quite an innocent statement, but understated all the same. What we're doing is we're seeing a lot of chaos, right? A lot of war in these hundred years. It's just this small statement. So that's what we're looking at. Today, we're going to get into, starting in verse 20. We'll see, I'm skeptical we'll finish the chapter, but I'm going to strive for that today. We'll see what a lot of people see as the prediction of the Antichrist. Last week, we looked at the verse Daniel 9:25 that represents the troublesome times. I'd like you, before we get into Daniel 11, to look at 1 John, the 2nd and the 4th chapters. 1 John 2, starting out, 1 John 2 and 18. I think this is kind of like Daniel 9:25 is the overcast of what we've been looking at. This is kind of the over-scheming or overriding concept that we'll be working from today. Children, it's the last hour, and you have heard that the Antichrist is coming. So now many Antichrists have come. Therefore, we know this is the last hour. They went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would have continued with us. But they went out, that it might become plain that they are not of us. But you have been anointed by the Holy One, and you all have knowledge. That passage continues and is good, but John says, what about the Antichrist? In John's time. He has come. In fact, not he, there are many, right? The 4th chapter. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are of God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know that the Spirit of God, every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you heard was coming and now is in the world already. So John reiterates that statement that the Antichrist was present. As we come through and we look at Antiochus the fourth, or Ephames, is he is called. He's seen by many to be the Antichrist and a prediction of the Antichrist to come. He clearly is. And I think that's the very point that Daniel's making. But I want to suggest this in light of John's statements. What's the Antichrist and what's the whole concept? If you remember that poster we had of Daniel and all the imagery that we have of Daniel, is this contrast between those who roll with the mindset and spirit of God and those that reject that and roll with the mindset and spirit of this world. And that's what we're going to see in Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, that he completely rejects God, completely rejects the Messiah, and lives according to man. And therefore, is this representation of the Antichrist. What's important about that, I think what's applicable about that, is it's really important to guard our own hearts, right? To make sure that we are serving the true and living God versus giving into any of these other concepts. In fact, 1 John 4:1 says, try the spirits. I think one application of that is make sure you know who's ruling your life. By what spirit are you serving? We're going to see another kind of spirit in Epiphanes, in Antiochus Epiphanes today. Questions or comments in that review and setting? So, Antiochus the third was known as Antiochus what? Do you recall? History makes these names so confusing. Essentially, reigning the north, there's two names, Antiochus and Secluus, and they go 1, 2, 3, 4, and it goes back and forth to which they're all of the same family at which name's going. So Antiochus the third, of whom we saw the death of at the end of last week, is Antiochus the Great. He was called Antiochus the Great because he did much more than those before him. He conquered much of Egypt, which is really what we're looking at, the battle that's taking place. So now, at the end, remember, he had some trouble with this new and upcoming power, being Rome. And he had some serious defeats right at the end of his life and right at the end of our reading in verse 19 last week. And so he had to come home and gather money to pay for his military expenditures and the tribute they now owed Rome because he was defeated. And he is raiding temples, and he's killed in temple raid and dies. That's the end of him. And with that, we're going to lead into, verse 20. How about this? That the next, essentially, from 21 through 45 is all about one ruler, right? Now, we've spent quite a bit on most of these rulers. How about this guy in verse 20? I'm going to read verse 20 and then we'll talk about him. Then shall rise in his place one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. Well, that's all we hear about him. One verse. Kind of a blip in history, right? And let that be a warning to anyone who tries to raise taxes. This man raised taxes. He gets one verse and he's gone. This is the Seleucus the Fourth, or Philopator is his other name. And he has this big debt to pay, and so his 6 or so years of reigning, 7 or 8 actually, is dedicated to raising taxes. He gets this guy, Herodotus, and sends him to collect taxes from Judea, and he's considered a prime minister. And within a few years, as I just mentioned, Seleucus IV is poisoned. He dies mysteriously. Most assume he's poisoned, right? He dies. So that's all we hear about him. And now, with this next verse, 21, we're right around 187 or so. Or 178. And we're going to read a section, verses 21 through 28. In this place shall rise a contemptible person. Oh, we're off to a good start, aren't we? A contemptible person. I completely lost him. Here he is. To whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Verse 21 there. This is Antiochus the fifth, and he is called Antiochus Ephanes. Ephanes means the illustrious one, the glorious one. And the Jews play a word play on this, and they call him Antiochus Ephanes. Ephanes. They leave out the H, and that means Antiochus the mad, or the crazy, right? So they make fun of him, and he's a horrible person, contemptible. He gets the rule not because he's someone of majesty. It wasn't given to him by right. He wasn't supposed to have it. But instead, he was the guard of a boy king. And he gets someone to kill the boy king, and then through flattery, he just grabs the throne, and he rules for about 8 years and does amazing and horrific things for several years. As I mentioned before, the rest of this chapter is all about him. So there's a lot to be written about. And we're going to see why that is in a few moments. His whole reign, he rules not only by force, but by deception and deceit. Verse 22, armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. So armies shall be swept before him. What are the two areas that are fighting over and over in this chapter? The north and the south. And Jerusalem's right in the middle. That's the perception we're seeing it from, right? Syria in the north, Egypt in the south. So what Antiochus does here is, Antiochus IV, is he has military victories unequaled. He does what no one's done before him, and he essentially conquers most of Egypt. Now, he's going to have 3 campaigns. This is campaign number 1. What's called Lower Egypt, which is actually northern Egypt, it's a little confusing, but I guess it's a matter of perception of where you're standing, is the most fertile lands. Antiochus IV is able to conquer all of it, right? The prosperous area with his armies. Verse 23, and from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with a small people. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province. He shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. And he shall stir up power in his heart against the king of the south with a great army. I didn't mean to read 25. I wanted to stop there. So this, through verse 24, is that first campaign. There's rules to war, aren't there? Where are the rules? What's the document that rules the rules of war today? Geneva Convention, right? Geneva Convention. We all sat down, we as people, and decided after World War II, here's what we won't do, and head off a few of the atrocities of war, as though we can do that. Right? There've always been rules of war. Remember, at the beginning of our country, it was customary for armies to stand up and face to face and aim your muskets at one another and see who the last man standing is. Eventually, after the colonists were getting whooped thoroughly, they said, man, we're going to quit doing this. They broke all the rules of war. Well, Antiochus breaks all the rules of war. And he does this over and over. He has most of Egypt conquered before they realize it. And Antiochus was prone to something that not many rulers prior to his time, or to a degree that most rulers were not. He would plunder his own lands and take the wealth. He would pay military merchants and mercenaries, and buy loyalty that way. So he's plundering his own land. It doesn't last. So up through 24, he makes a peace treaty with the South. And he says, we're not going to fight anymore. I've got most of your land conquered, right? Now, one of the ways that he did this, Cleopatra's two brothers are at odds with one another, and he is so artful at telling each of them he's helping them out, and essentially just keeping them at odds with each other to his own gain, right? So that is kind of who this person is. Questions or comments on those verses? So continuing on in verse 25, I need to get back to Daniel 11 here. My Bible left me. So they have a peace treaty. He comes back to the north, but he's ruling. And over time, Egypt, prepares and they take their land back. And so we have the second push into Egypt, starting in verse 25. And he shall stir up powers in his heart against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great mighty army. But he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. And as for the two kings, their heart shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but no avail, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed. We're going to pause there for two reasons. So, number one, you see the South gets this great and exceeding army, but they don't succeed because of plotting, right? This is Antiochus' way. And I just mentioned a moment ago how he does that. He gets two brothers fighting each other, internal fighting, and he's able to continue on with his war with the support, really, of each of them. An alliance is made, and they sit down at a table together. Where did that go? Yes. Thank you. So he's sitting down with one of the Ptolemies, and history records, this is interesting, that Antiochus is pretending to have Ptolemy's best interest at heart, and the Ptolemy is pretending to believe him. Meanwhile, both of them are scheming behind the end, and history records as clear as day. So they're both pretending to know each other. Now, what this is leading to is the third and final push into Egypt that Antiochus has. And by this time, Cleopatra is won out in two regards. She's convinced her two brothers to quit catering to Antiochus, to join forces and to fight against them. And secondly, do you remember historically who Cleopatra makes really, really good friends with? Friends. You remember? What kind of politics does she get tied up in? Eventually it ends up being her ending. What other nation? Not just Egypt. She gets tied into someone other's. Rome. Yeah. So Cleopatra puts an end to Antiochus's reign in Egypt. We're going to see that leads to another kind of problem. By getting her two brothers to join forces, quit fighting with each other, and by making alliances with Rome. We're going to see that come into play in just a moment. But in verse 27 here, and thank you for your help, Corey, Antiochus is sweeping through Egypt again, and we're starting to see that the plotting is falling apart. I just told you why, but I'm getting ahead of myself and telling you why it's falling apart. It's falling apart, and it's going to be to no avail. Now, to no avail. What is Antiochus's goal, his immediate goal? Right? Because talking about the overall scheme, that's another story. What's he trying to do? To conquer what? In particular, you're right, Bob, we're kind of getting at the overall goal. What's his goal in this verse? Where's he at? Where's he waging war? Egypt. Now, from Daniel's perspective, it's all about the north, Syria, in the south, right? And remember that what we're talking about is the 70 weeks when the Messiah is going to be present from the prior chapter. And so the end is yet to be appointed. Antiochus is about to completely conquer Egypt, but he's not going to accomplish it. Why? It's not time for these wars to be over. This is the point. This is the important point. Who's in control? God. All these things going on. Imagine, we're going to need encouragement shortly as Jews in the next passage because things get bad. You think they're bad now. They're about to get bad. We need encouragement. And so imagine living during this time. If you don't have this written, all these things are happening. It's out of control. And what many of the Jews do is they look for allies. They actually ally with Antiochus. Seems reasonable to do. He's the most powerful. You might as well do what you can. But lying, the faithful ones, the godly ones, the holy ones, as I believe the Maccabean books refer to them, understand these passages and say, wait, no. Even though all this is going on, and it looks like Antiochus is going to win the war, he's not going to because the time's not appointed yet. Because when all this fighting stops, something else greater is going to happen. That to me is powerful. Questions, comments? So, verse 28. And he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will in return to his own land. Now, so he leaves Egypt. He doesn't get it all conquered, but what's he carrying with him? Yeah, a lot of wealth, right? He's just plundered the land. He's bringing this wealth back. Now, and he shall, the statement for that, verse 28, he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against what? The Holy Covenant. What's that or who's that? God? Absolutely. God's law, that refers to the covenant. Can we be more specific in this case? God, God's law, but God's people. Right? That's what it's referring to, is God's people in his covenant. Now, I want to come back to a verse that actually, unintentionally, verse 22, I unintentionally left a statement undealt with, but it's really important. So as Antiochus is first coming to power in verse 22, army shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. See, there's the same terminology, right? Prince of the covenant, he's against the covenant later. Last week, I gave you this scenario that took place, and I was a little ahead of myself, but what I was doing is trying to set the picture of what's taking place inside Jewish politics at this time. In verse 22, we are seeing there the Prince of the Covenant. Can anyone tell me who the Prince of the Covenant is? Or not by name, but position. Name's a lot more difficult. Who religiously in the Old Testament would be the most important person? The high priest. Yep, the high priest. And at this time, the high priest ruled, right? There was no king. He had rule. Now, I told you this last week, but this is where it actually takes place. Onias the third is ruling. He's the high priest. Jason, whose Hebrew name was Yeshua, took the Greek version of his name, Jason. He was a Hellenist. He was Onias's brother. But he looked different. He believed differently. And he was a Hellenist, meaning he accepted Greek culture. He wanted to modernize the religion. And so he tells Antiochus, I will pay you a higher tribute than my brother. And so Antiochus comes in and he kills him. And I mentioned this last week, but Jason starts to set up gymnasiums and all the things that went with them at that time, right? We don't think of gyms as a wicked place. But there was a lot more tied into it at this time. And so what comes out of that is this rift where we're going so radical on this way. Remember this in politics, right? For our own selves. What happens when we go to radical sides of this side? It's about momentum, right? So there's this radical side on the other side that becomes rebellious. And all kinds of things start to take place against the government, and they're kind of revolting, right? That leads to problems for Antiochus, and I'll talk about how he deals with that in this last stage. But that's all that's taken place prior to this verse. Questions or comments on that?
Money than the other, and which one was the one that got killed?
So that's a repetitive story. To this point in the story, Onias the third was the high priest that was a devout Orthodox Jew. He was killed. His brother Joshua is his Hebrew name. Jason's name he took from the Greek version of that, is his brother. So he's still a Levite. If you remember from last week, that gets to be important. Still has a right to be high priest, in other words. And Jason's the one that's bringing in Hellenistic or Greek influence. Does that answer your question? So Jason, said, hey, I'll pay you more. That's how he gets power. So Antiochus sends troops in, kills Onias, and now Jason is high priest. So you're starting to see this corruption of the Jewish religion, right? And all the situations that take place from that. Questions or comments? By the way, my statement about politics and the pendulum swinging is applicable for today. I want to be clear on my intent in saying that. I'm not saying I don't ever want to discourage people from voting. I think voting's a great thing. Here's my point. What we see in all these cases is politics will make the situation worse, not better. Right? That's not where their trust is. And that's the point that Daniel's making. We're going to see all these political forces back and forth, but it's godliness that's going to have the impact. You know, as Christians, church, this winning hearts and minds. We don't want laws that uphold Christianity. We want hearts that uphold Christianity. That's the whole point of Christianity, right? And until we win the hearts of people, you're just going to see this radical pendulum swinging that we see throughout history. I can't remember who said it, but I read a quote. The one thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. We're seeing that, right? This big circle in these passages. So, I want to be clear, and I don't mean to discourage anyone from participating in their civil duty. I do want to discourage you from putting your trust in man and constantly point to Jesus. So, in verse 28, he comes out of Egypt, and where does he have to go back through? Jerusalem, right? And he shall work, back another phrase. But his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land. So there's this idea where he kind of plunders much of Judea on his way through back to Syria. But that's only a preview of what's to come. It's going to get worse.
I always key in on words like this where it says, and he shall work his will. Like when you're thinking about yourself constantly and doing what you think is right in your own sight, then nothing good is ever coming out of that. It needs to be set on the Lord, what the Lord wants you to do.
Yeah. And jumping on that, Corey, I think the statement in this verse is closely connected to what you're saying, because Antiochus, as we mentioned, has the spirit of the Antichrist. So what I think we're saying here is no one's going to stop him from working his will. And you're right, that's the first step of that. But the people of Judea are being told, he's going to do what he wants. You're not going to stop him. It's going to be terrible, in other words, his people of God. So, great point. Thank you for coming. All right. So, continuing on then in verse, so far we've had 2 campaigns into the south. The third is about to take place at the 29th, in verse 29. At the appointed time he shall return and come into the south. What's that appointed time? Who's in control? God. And so, Corey, I think there's a tremendous contrast too to his will. Even though he's let go to do what he wants and wills, he's not in control, right? At the appointed time he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. What happened the last 2 times he came in to the south? Military victories, right? After military victory. Verse 30, for ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. Boy, there's probably enough there to keep us occupied for a while. So, it's not as it was the previous 2 times. He is stopped. He's meeting a little more resistance this time. And he is got the city of Alexandria fortified, or he's besieging it rather. And who shows up? That Alexandria is a historical detail that I gave you. Verse 30. Who's going to come and stop them? Yes. So,
are they in the Mediterranean Sea there, coming up through that?
Yes. So the ships of Kittim. Now, Kittim means Cyprus. Ships of Cyprus? But in the Jewish language, that meant Cyprus and anything west of it, which would include Rome. In fact, the interpreters of the Septuagint translate this, and the Romans will come. They understood what it meant, right? It's not a literal translation. It's getting to the meaning of it when they interpret it. Wasn't that what Benjamin Franklin was screaming as he rode through the streets? The Romans are coming. I shouldn't do that. I'm sorry. I'm not really sorry, but I know that was great observation, though. I do feel if Paul Revere was saying who's coming, the British are coming. So it was why should you trust anything I say, right? The funny part is I do that and worse unintentionally. So the Romans are coming. Now, the Romans show up, and I didn't tell you this, but Antiochus was raised in Rome as a boy, so he understood Rome. He understood they were someone to be appeased. Right? His predecessor was done in by trying to fight Rome. Antiochus understood Rome. So the Rome ships show up. He goes to Antiochus, the Roman general does, and he says, go home and stay out of Egypt. Why? We already talked about that. Cleopatra is involved, right? And so Antiochus starts his normal flattery, and he's trying to buy time. And history records this really neat moment. The Roman general takes his staff and he draws a circle around Antiochus in the sand, and he says, you will decide before you exit that circle. Antiochus is not going to be able to buy time. And so Antiochus, understanding who Rome is, withdraws. Very angry, very upset, very defeated, without fight against Rome. And look what takes place. And now it gets real. And this is why we have so much time spent on this horrible ruler. Verse 30 again, for the ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. He's going to turn back and he's going to take his wrath out on Judea. If he can no longer campaign in Egypt, he's going to roll his homeland, his home territory. And he pays attention to those who forsake. He gets traitors, apostate Jews to ally with him. And boy, do things get horrific. I think Corey pointed out earlier. This is not God's will being done. Two things for you to research before next week. What takes place following can be found in the book of the Maccabees. It's in the Catholic Bible, right? In particular, First Maccabees. And secondly, if you would read Hebrews 11, 30 through 40, and we'll talk about the correlation there next week, Lord willing. Thank you.